Good day, ladies and gents. This is Allegory to Zeitgeist with Alex and Byron. Have you ever been enjoying a movie or TV show, reading a great story, or just watching the world roll on by, and found yourself wondering what would happen to all this if? Perhaps you want to sprinkle a little chaos into the mundane, or maybe you're just curious about the minutiae of an extraordinary situation. Of course you've wondered about it. It's natural curiosity. You wouldn't be you if you hadn't, and let's face it, who doesn't like you? Well, in summation, that's pretty much the gist of our show. We'll be delving into the fantastical worlds of superheroes, TV shows and film. We're getting meta about movies and overthinking everything. If you're an intrepid cognitive explorer and that sounds like your barrel of whiskey or your particular brand of weird, then empty out your fun bags and get ready to fill them right back up again with something entirely stranger. Fair warning, we will be talking about all manner of movies and TV shows and everything in between. So there'll be a spoiler warning in effect in perpetuity. Although, in fairness, our references are largely about things that are either so popular or so old that if you're uninformed, then shame on you. Get yourself down to Blockbuster and rent yourself a VHS and you'll be up to date in no time. And now, with all the ado out of the way, let's get straight to our next episode.
Okay, so today we're talking about movies. Broad subject for us, so we've narrowed it down somewhat to 2 decades. We are looking at the differences between movies in the 90s and the movies of the 2010s. So there is a decade of separation between the two, and there was some sort of logic behind that, which I don't feel the need to explain to you. But we are going to look at the top 10 grossing movies of the 1990s, top 10 grossing movies of the last 10 years, and some critically acclaimed movies thrown in the mix as well for discussion. And I hope you enjoy the ride. So, starting off with a list of the 1990s, I'm going to actually start off just outside the list, and hopefully when I mention these two particular movies, you'll understand why. Top 10 grossing movies of the 90s, according to IMDb, just outside of that list at 12 was Ghost in 1990, and in 1991, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. For people that grew up in the 90s or are particular fans of fantasy or sci-fi movies, like myself and Byron are, the Terminator 2 missing out on the top 10 is kind of a big deal, because arguably it's the best film in the Terminator franchise. I know a lot of people feel differently, might prefer the first one, still a great movie. I'm not sure there'd be too many people arguing for anything that came after Terminator 2, but maybe there are, you never know. But Terminator 2 was a huge movie. It's rated 8.5 on IMDb, which is pretty high, and is higher than some of the other movies that did gross more. So that is justification in of itself to say that the amount of movie a money makes is not always a marker of quality, potentially, or critical success and financial success are not always the same. Sometimes they do align, but just because those two particular movies are quite iconic, and they're very well received by fans, I did want to just mention it. But at number 10, Armageddon, 1998. Great soundtrack by Trevor Rabin. Good movie for Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck, Liv Tyler. Great song by Aerosmith. I forget the lady that wrote that, but she wrote loads of hits in the 90s, and it was a big turnabout for them as well. So, good action movie, funny, and great music to it. Number 9, you got Men in Black, which was a turning point for Will Smith, unquestionably. What a lot of people probably don't realise is it's a comic book movie, which weren't so popular at the time, but huge movie. It's obviously spawned a couple of sequels. On the subject of that, second one, not such a big fan of. The third one, I don't know what everybody else thought, I really enjoyed. Thought it was a good movie. It tied things up quite nicely. Not such a fan of the more recent one with Chris Hemsworth. Good cast, good intentions, just didn't pan out, I don't think. Anyway, number 8, Jurassic Park: The Lost World. So the sequel, higher up the list, I'm not going to say where just yet, but obviously the first Jurassic Park will come in there, and quite frankly, why wouldn't it? Number 7, M. Night Shyamalan comes in with The Sixth Sense at number 7, so there's some, irony there. Great movie, probably one of his best. Byron, you've watched just about everything that guy's done. would you say that his earlier stuff is better? As a broad generalisation, we could do a whole episode about M. Night Shyamalan, but as a broad stroke, I think maybe his earlier stuff is better than his more recent stuff. What do you think?
I would tend to agree. I do like his more recent stuff as well. I know he had a spat in the middle where he was doing almost some movies that not many people might even knew that he was the director ultimately, so they're a little bit more forgettable. But then equally, any director's always going to have the right to go off and take on some passion projects and things that they wouldn't normally do. That kind of breaks the mould in their typical kind of films. But yeah, the earlier ones are generally kind of very, it's almost like its own new genre of film really. So his later ones still very good, absolutely love, especially Glass, the most recent one. I know Old has just come out at the time of recording this, so I'll be seeing that soon. But yeah, his earlier stuff I would say kind of had an edge to it because it was kind of surprising to us. But now I think we know what to expect with his movies, so I think that plays into it quite well.
Yeah, I think in fairness to him, it must be difficult to keep writing movies over and over again with a huge plot twist, especially when it's a plot driven twist. And what I mean by that is one where when you reflect on the movie, the signs, no pun intended, were there all along for the twist. You were being led down that path the whole time, but they were disguised well enough that you didn't necessarily see it coming. So yeah, it's got to be difficult. But for the earlier stuff that he put out, like The Sixth Sense, Signs, Unbreakable, great twists, great movies, telling really good stories, and turning those particular genres that they were almost fitting into right on their head. So good for him. But number 6, Forrest Gump, 1994, Oscar-winning performance for Tom Hanks. Amazing soundtrack by Alan Silvestri. That's just a great film. I think to be able to make a movie where you're telling the story of somebody's life over a period of many, many years, those movies always tend to do good in terms of awards, and they tend to be well received at the box office. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're always good films, but Forrest Gump is unquestionably a fantastic film. It's iconic. Number 5, Independence Day, another standout action movie for Will Smith. Obviously that came out while he was still doing The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, I think I'm right in saying, or he may just have come to an end. But that was a big role for him. Harry Connick Jr. I think's in that with him as well. It's one of the other fighter pilots. Bill Pullman's great in it. That's a stacked cast. It's got the right balance of action and comedy. Really, really good film. Considerably better than the sequel that came out many, many years later. Number 4, The Lion King. This movie is easily one of the best movies ever made. I haven't actually looked at the list of IMDb, but if this isn't in the top, I'm going to say top 20 of greatest movies of all time, I would genuinely be surprised. It's a fantastic story. It's got an amazing score by Hans Zimmer. You've obviously got Elton John and Tim Rice contributing with the songs. The voice talents of that. I mean, you get such sincerity in like Matthew Broderick's voice, and you've got a good balance of comedy. Disney, with their animated features years ago, especially in the 90s, they never seemed to be scared of going places like children's stories have always been cautionary tales, like the original Brothers Grimm stories. There's always a darkness to them, and they can get very dark, like especially if you go way back to things like Pinocchio, and that they get really quite. If you showed them to children today, they'd probably get quite scared. But there's always a brighter side to it. I think The Lion King is a great story to tell. It's a fantastically put together feature, and it's got an amazing soundtrack. It's an Oscar-winning film. Obviously spawned a stage show which is still going today, and the live action sequel, which I'm going to get to a little bit later on. Where did it feature in the list? Have you found it?
It's 39 on the IMDb 250.
That's not terrible. I would have honestly thought it would be a little bit higher up, but we're doing things on the fly here because we didn't know we were going to. I don't know what I'm going to do most of the time. Things just sort of tumble out of my head. But is that Forrest Gump at number 12?
Yeah.
and Fight Club, another 90s movie, which incidentally, spoiler alert, didn't get into the top 10 of grossing movies according to IMDb. But after looking at this list, I looked at a few critically acclaimed lists for the 90s, because there was a number of movies that I was spinning around in my head that I was a fan of, that I knew, people like Byron and other friends of mine were fans of, that were popular, that didn't crack the list. There's a lot of great movies in the 90s that need to be talked about, and that changed the way cinema was made, or standout performances. Like the very, very top of the list, the Shawshank Redemption, 1994, probably the greatest movie that certainly Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman have ever done. It's got an incredible soundtrack. It's visually stunning. It's a hell of a story, and it's difficult not to get sucked into that movie. That is one of those films that completely sweeps you away with it, and it does what movies are supposed to do. It's true escapism. It's a wonderful story, and it's got a great message to it, because obviously the primary objective is that it's about hope. So it's, if you haven't watched that movie, get yourself down to Blockbuster and go and check it out. Right, now where was I? We got to The Lion King. So top 3, we have the return of a long-awaited franchise from George Lucas. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out in 1999. George Lucas promised in the 80s that he was going to get to a prequel trilogy, not long after doing Return of the Jedi, and it took a long time before he got there. But I don't care what anybody says about this. I think it's a good picture. It's got a great cast to it. Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor work really well together. I think if we're taking out the Imperial March and the main Star Wars theme, I think it's got the best piece of music of any Star Wars movie, which is Duel of Fates. So an original piece by John Williams for the new trilogy, accompanied visually with what I think is the best lightsaber battle of any Star Wars film. I'm not going to go too far down the Star Wars rabbit hole, but I think that movie is a good picture, in spite of Jar Jar Binks and what other people may say about it. Number 2, Jurassic Park, which, again, amazing John Williams score, Steven Spielberg picture, true fantasy picture. It's incredible, and obviously the ideas behind that movie are still going now in the Jurassic World franchise, which has put out some pretty good movies, and I'm looking forward to the next one. That's real escapism in this film. It's a brilliant notion, and quite honestly, if that really existed, and I mean the way the world is going now, it doesn't look like it's too far-fetched, not nearly as far-fetched as it was in 1993. If somebody said to you, you could go to Jurassic Park, I think I would probably put my hand up pretty quickly. I know just about everybody in my life would probably say the same. So where do you come down on that argument? Would you go to Jurassic Park if it really existed? And number 1, probably unsurprisingly, because we're talking about highest grossing movies, Titanic. So this was, for many, many years, the highest grossing movie of all time, and all credit to cast and crew and to James Cameron for the detail he put into it. We've had a number of conversations about James Cameron in the past, and I don't particularly like James Cameron, but I do like a number of the movies that he puts out, and I think there's something to be said for being able to separate how you feel about somebody personally to how you feel about what they do creatively, because what people put out into the world is invariably the best part of themselves. I do feel like there are, there's while we're talking about the 90s, there's an animated film called Fern Gully that came out in the 90s, which is a really cool film. It is, if you watch it, it's pretty much Avatar. Avatar is almost entirely lifted verbatim from this film, but and Terminator wasn't an original story. Obviously Titanic wasn't, but it did have original stories in there. He's certainly got a knack for being able to take other people's stories and elevate them. I'll never take that away from the guy. It'd just be nice to see him do something truly original, see what he could do with something he had come up with entirely by himself. Because he's obviously got the skills, and you can't argue one of the greatest filmmakers in popular cinema history. But there you go. That's the top 10 list of the 90s of grossing movies. Before we get on to critically acclaimed films, I want to compare that to the same list from 2010 to 2020, which is it's what struck me about this was that there are a lot of similarities, and as I'll go through it, I honestly thought there'd be more different, but as I go through it, you'll see what I'm talking about. Just outside of the top 10, as I did before, there was a couple of standout movies, so well, maybe not, depending on how you feel about it, but Star Wars The Last Jedi came in at number 12. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 came in at number 11, which is honestly quite surprising, because it was the end of a long-running franchise, of a considerable amount of time and a considerable investment in viewership. So I'm a little surprised I didn't crack that list. But coming in at number 10 is Black Panther. This, I believe, won an Oscar. I want to say for costume design. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it certainly was a very visually striking movie. I've got to be honest, probably my least favourite of the Marvel movies. Mainly for I'll hold my hand up to it. Mainly for petty things like the fight scenes were very difficult to track visually, to see what was going on. I think one of the earliest scenes in the film, he's wearing a black suit and it takes place at night, and I watched it in the cinema. It was really difficult to see what was going on. And then the main fight at the end, they're underground, it's dark, they're both wearing black suits, and they're moving around very quickly. Really difficult to track what was happening. There are other parts of the film which are really good, and there's some great stuff going on. The music was pretty good, it was visually attractive. There's some great comedy in there from... oh crikey, I've forgotten his name. British actor that played Gollum in Lord of the Rings.
Oh, Serkis.
Yeah, Andy Serkis. I did really like it's nothing to do with the film itself necessarily, but I watched a lot of the press tour that these guys did leading up to it, and I love the fact they were going around referring to themselves as the token white guys in the film. I just thought that was really funny. It lightened things a bit, and it made the film a little bit less of a political statement and more of a good creative outlet. But I think compared to a lot of the other Marvel properties, it's personally not my favourite, but that is just my personal opinion on the matter. Where are we after that? So that came in at number 10. Number 9, Avengers Age of Ultron. We're establishing a theme here. There's obviously, in that decade, there's going to be a number of Marvel properties. I think that was the last Joss Whedon Marvel movie that he put together. I don't think... I mean, this is rated 7.3, so it's not terrible, but it's not the highest rated Marvel property. But it is one of those films, I think, when you re-watch it after a few years, you find yourself surprised by how good it actually is, because I think it's probably better than the memory it leaves with you. Frozen 2 at number 8, which is a good film. There's some great songs in there. Fast 7 at number 7. And then we've got The Avengers, 2012's Avengers, or Avengers Assemble if you're in the UK, coming in at number 6. Now this is where things start to get a little bit weird. Number 5, The Lion King. And I hear you ask, deja vu? Well, no, you're not imagining things. It's the live action remake of The Lion King. So we are certainly getting to a point where it feels like big studios are running out of original ideas. And then just to reinforce that point, at number 4, Jurassic World. So there is some sort of repetition here. However, in fairness, I feel like, I don't know where you stand on this, B, but I feel like Jurassic World was a really good extension of the Jurassic Park series. It felt quite organic. I think they did a really good job of it. Bryce Dallas Howard and Chris Pratt have got amazing chemistry together. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think many of us were... I think we were looking forward to it, but we were a bit worried about, are they just going to repeat the same old thing again? They go to a park and things are good for a while, but then something goes wrong and all goes haywire. And although that did kind of happen, they did it in a way where at least I felt it was kind of acceptable. Like, and now obviously, well, without spoiling anything, the next one is very likely to be very different. But I feel they set up, this possible new trilogy quite well.
Yeah, I like that there was a good balance of fan service to the old movies as well, and the original John Williams score was worked in with some original music as well from more up and coming composers. So it was, I think they balanced that very, very well, and Jake Johnson in there brings some really good comic relief. So it's exactly what you want. I think Steven Spielberg probably quite rightly approved of it, so that's all the endorsement that you need. Number 3, Avengers Infinity War, which is a fantastic film. It's got some amazing action sequences in there. I think one of the greatest moments in any of the Marvel movies for me is Thor arriving in Wakanda. It's just brilliant. If you like it, you revert to being a 9-year-old watching an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. When that happens, you can't not smile, because this like powerful muscular dude has showed up and he's going to kick the crap out of a bunch of people, which is, I don't know why that's entertaining or why I'm smiling now just thinking about it. It just is. Why is that entertaining, B? Why do we like to see somebody show up and just beat the crap out of a load of bad guys? I'm not sure why. It's like a Hulk Hogan thing.
Yeah, it's kind of just a peak on an emotional roller coaster, isn't it? He was going through a bit of a difficult time with the whole process of kind of forging the new weapon, etc. And he was kind of absent for a lot of the film. You don't really see him get to do much, so I think they kind of saved it all up. And of course, we didn't exactly get a lot from the Hulk to compensate. So I'm guessing this was something we probably were very much.
We were owed it by that point. Yeah. And I love the relationship that they paired him up with the Guardians. I thought that, because it's not what you would expect, but it worked out for some really good comic relief in the movie. And the bit where him and Eitri are talking about how taking the full force of a sun would kill him is brilliant. Peter Dinklage's comic timing, that is great, and that's another great moment to sort of help you realise how powerful Thor is. I mean, first of all, he survived a ship exploding and he's floating around in space and he's still alive, and then he takes the full force of a sun and he's still alive. And I mean, it does serve to show you how powerful Thanos really is, because he damn near beat Thor to death, and then the same in Endgame as well. So they've done a really good job, I think, of showing you that Thor is no walkover by any means, but Thanos just happens to be considerably more powerful. There's some great moments for a lot of different characters in that film. There's some great action sequences. It's got that balance of everything that Marvel do so well. And some people enjoy it more than Endgame as well. I think Endgame is much, much heavier, and I don't mind admitting I cry considerably just about every time I watch the end of that film, because it's hard for, I mean, not just because Robert Downey Jr., spoiler alert, but Robert Downey Jr. dies in Endgame. I don't know whether anybody realised that, but considering that it came out nearly 3 years ago now. But watching a dad have to leave his wife and kids is pretty hard. Number 2, Star Wars Force Awakens. Not really surprised about this, because I think a lot of people that are fans of the new trilogy will probably say that the first one in that series is the best one. I mean, it's certainly got a lot of positive elements to it. It's as you'd expect. It's great. There's great music to it. It's got incredible. It's visually very attractive. You've got a great balance of the cast. John Boyega his comic timing is great. He reminds me of like a young Mel Gibson or like a Ryan Reynolds or somebody like that, in as much as they can do action movies and they're convincing in those moments, but at any given moment they can turn around and say something glib and sarcastic and you'll laugh at it. But it doesn't detract from the character they're playing. I think that's a real, very delicate balance of personality traits that you've got to have to be able to do that. So number 2 was Force Awakens, and number 1, as we've just discussed, Avengers Endgame, which up until very, very recently was the highest grossing movie of all time. And then I think James Cameron re-released Avatar in Asia just so he could get his box office receipts slightly above that and get back on the number 1 spot, which is why I don't particularly like James Cameron, but that's my personal opinion. Anyhow, there we go. So that's the movies from top 10 grossing movies according to IMDb from the 1990s and from the 2010s. Now we've gone through them all. Right off the bat, there's some obvious similarities there, as I pointed out along the way. Like with you've got Star Wars movies in both lists. You have got comic book movies in both lists, although very different. And you've got The Lion King in both lists. Not just a Disney film, you've got the same Disney film in both lists in similar position as well. I'm gonna put my nuts out the window and say didn't like the new Lion King movie. And you could argue I'm a child of the 90s. I think the original Lion King is an incredible movie. The score, I've seen Hans Zimmer perform that live, and I don't mind telling you, it drove me to tears. It's incredible. The music in that is so emotive. I think it's one of those things that when you're trying to remake a movie, if you remake any other movie, you reboot a movie, for example. Let's take an action movie. For argument's sake, let's say you take a Commando, like a low-level action movie from the 80s. You want to remake it today. You could probably do that with a reasonable amount of success because it wasn't particularly a huge movie when it came out. There's not a huge amount in terms of story. It's a pretty cut and dry story. It's just a fun, entertaining action movie. That's kind of a blank slate to be able to put your own imprint on as a filmmaker. Pick a new, younger action star, or maybe someone a bit more seasoned like Dwayne Johnson, and you could probably turn that into a reasonably successful movie. It's not going to break records, but it'll probably do quite well for itself. If you take something that was Oscar winning and iconic and defined a generation and sort of hit it out of the park in every measurable category of the film, and then try to remake it almost word for word, and all you've done is re-render the animation, so you take away the emotive expressions of the characters because you're trying to make them look more like an actual animal who can't express emotion facially. I think all you're going to do is remove the magic that made the original film so special.
Well, I haven't actually seen The Lion King, to be honest. Not through lack of wanting to, just one of those, films that just kind of like missed the boat ultimately. But I understand the concept though, yeah. So it's definitely there's always like kind of a magic to some of the earlier films because it's your first introduction to it. It's something you've never seen before, something you could conceive of. But when you come round to the next one, whether it's a remake, sequel, etc., you kind of know what you're in for, and then it's almost less of a new entire experience with a blank canvas, so to say. So it's a difficult one because, of course, second time round they're always going to make improvements to special effects and anything else, of course, that may have been potentially lacking in the first one. So it's a difficult one, but I feel in terms of the story and how it makes you feel, of course, the first one, your first introduction to it, is always going to be the most special, regardless of the revenue it makes, the box office.
Had I known that you hadn't seen The Lion King, I wouldn't have teed you up for that. So I apologise for putting you in the frame there, but in my defence, that's a startling revelation to me, and honestly, I don't think I know anyone other than you who hasn't seen it. So if you haven't got it on your list, I insist it goes onto your IMDb list of movies to watch.
I'll get down to Blockbuster.
Yeah, get yourself down there. Get some popcorn. That's something as an aside, but that's something I never got into. I've never particularly cared for popcorn. And honestly, popcorn and crisps in the cinema, noisiest bloody things on the face of the earth when you're trying to watch a film. Whose idea was that? Like chocolate or gummy sweets or things like that. Totally get that. That's fine. But whose idea was it to sell crisps and popcorn at a cinema? Whoever's idea it was needs to be slapped hard in the face with a large fish. But to discuss something that I know you have seen, that we're both fans of, that didn't quite make the cut, the Terminator series. So Terminator 1 doesn't quite make our list in terms of time frame, but he's undoubtedly a sort of game-changing movie, in as much as something else that didn't make the list, which is genuinely startling to me, The Matrix, which I don't think anyone could reasonably argue isn't a game-changing movie. It absolutely was, and it spawned, if you were alive at that time, it's of the right sort of age, it spawned a whole culture at the time. You had really great games coming out at the time. Did you play the PlayStation? I want to say PlayStation 2. I might be slightly off the mark, but yeah, I'm pretty sure there was Matrix games that came out where you played Jada Smith's character.
Yes, that was Enter the Matrix. Yeah, you played her, and I think Ghost, I think his name was.
Yeah.
So yeah, you played those, which was running sort of concurrently to possibly the second film, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was one of those games where it starts off running alongside a film and then it takes place between two films, and they've done that recently with like the newer Star Wars Battlefront, for example, which is a great addition to a movie. I've always thought that's kind of an untapped resource, particularly with sci-fi movies, because you're invariably going to get a big crossover in audience between people who play games and people that watch those movies, and they are another medium to tell a lot of story that you don't necessarily have the screen time for in the cinema. So those sorts of things are always welcome addition. But you had the Animatrix as well, which told a lot of different stories, and it filled a lot of different gaps in and answered questions and things with the Matrix as a property. There are a lot of questions, that people want to know more about the world and how it works and stuff like that. So the first Matrix movie, in terms of how films were made, is groundbreaking. In the same way that in the 70s, Rocky brought about the Steadicam so that you could move up and down stairs without the camera going all over the place, and they brought about the means to do things like bullet time. So that changed the way that films were made. It changed the way that people looked at things, and the whole there's iconic scenes. When you see the in memoriam part of like the Oscars, for example, and you look back at somebody's career, Lawrence Fishburne, when it's his time to depart this mortal coil, there is going to be, anyone that's got any sense is going to put the scene in there where he's sitting across from Neo, offering him the pills, or when he's comparing a human being to a battery. He's obviously done a great many other films and some incredible performances, and as I'm sure got many more left in him, but those are going to be defining moments of his career. It obviously reinvigorated and took Keanu Reeves' career to a whole other level. And as much as I'm a fan of Will Smith, and the guy is an incredible actor, I will fight you if you say otherwise. I think we're probably both in agreement he was not the right person for that role, not at that time in his life anyway. If you rebooted it now, I know they are doing a fourth one as we speak, but let's say, for example, The Matrix had never happened and you shot that movie now. If you cast Will Smith as Lawrence Fishburne's character, whose name escapes me, help me out. Morpheus, thank you very much. that just went straight out of my head. If you cast him as Morpheus, you'd get an amazing performance. But as Neo, especially at that age he was then, at that point in his life with the experience that he'd had, I think somebody who is naturally more dour and more deadpan, like Keanu Reeves is, a bit more reserved, and with the things that were going on in his life at the time, the darkness that was happening, I think a much better fit for the role, and obviously it worked out very well. But things like that, right? So you got movies in the 90s. Coming back to my original point, you got Terminator 2, amazing film. I think the best one in the Terminator franchise. compared to the way they've tried to reinvigorate the Terminator franchise over the last... So in the last 10 years, what did we have? Because I think Salvation falls just outside of that. Terminator 3 falls outside of that. But we did have Genesis and... I forget the name of the most recent one. With the tall blonde lady in it from that Mars movie with... Oh wow, I'm names are escaping me today. The Martian. She was in The Martian. Tall blonde lady. Forgot her name. Never mind. Anyway, you know what we're talking about. The most recent Terminator movie, where you've got the Hispanic-looking dude chasing after the bio-enhanced tall blonde lady, who's trying to protect the Hispanic lady. Now, these movies, I'm not. First of all, I'm not sure why they needed to be made. I think it's a case of making a movie because you think you can make money out of it because there's still interest in the property, which is probably fair to say. Like, fans of any particular franchise, I think, normally have this reaction. If it's a franchise that's gone back a long way, and you hear, they're making a new Terminator movie, your two things happen in a split second. You're instantly excited and disappointed at the same time in equal measure. You're like, oh, cool. I hope they don't ruin it. And that's pretty much what I think will go through most people's minds really, really quickly as soon as they hear about that. Like what happened to me the other day when somebody told me they were actually shooting the new Indiana Jones film at the moment. And I thought, okay. Yeah, I mean, Harrison Ford's brilliant. The Indiana Jones films are great. We need to do that again, Is it the case that when you do a movie like that, you are introducing that franchise to a whole new generation who are then going to go back and look at the earlier ones and see how great they were? And also you're going to make a bit of money at the same time? Or would they be best left alone? What do you think? Well, let's take Terminator right off the bat, because that's something we both have got strong opinions about. We both really like the older Terminator movies. Was it worth redoing the more recent ones?
It's difficult to know, because obviously we're coming from a fan's perspective, so of course we only really look at it from the perspective of, did it add to the story, did we enjoy it? But of course from the other side, of course, they're like, did it make money? So that's the challenge ultimately. So I think they're going to continue to do it because it's the sunk cost effect, isn't it? Because we've committed already ourselves to the story and knowing about the characters and the story arc and things like that. It's psychology. We have to see how it continues or ends.
Yeah.
So they'll keep going, and they know that we'll keep seeing it, even if we possibly do predict it might not be very good. We're still going to have to see it out of curiosity, and that's how studios
they're going to make
take
the money
advantage.
Back. So, two questions off the back of that. Did the most recent Terminator movie add to the story, to the canon, if you like, of the Terminator history? Or did it undo and try and rewrite the Terminator history?
Oh, in my opinion, absolutely the second one. You can kind of see there's not much more you can do involving the past, and of course with Arnie aging as well, obviously making that a lot more of a challenge ultimately. They're obviously just trying to test the waters on setting up potentially a new franchise, and in such obviously it's very difficult, of course, because we know what to expect, and if they don't quite give that to us and they try and take it in a different direction, which obviously doesn't make too much sense to people who are familiar with the past and the previous films, then also it's going to be a bit jarring ultimately. But that's clearly, in my opinion, what they're trying to do. They're trying to, set up the heroes of the future films by, removing a certain very prominent character immediately at the start of this one, who I won't mention just for spoiler's sake. But yes, in so doing, obviously you're setting up the new wave of potential characters going forward, assuming of course they are going to make another one, which I doubt, but then I wouldn't be terribly surprised if they do.
Well, my second question sort of you touched on there. Is there a reluctance to conclude certain characters these days, and if so, why? So I think Terminator 2, one of the many reasons why it's a fantastic film, is because it is a conclusion. It's they tie off all of the ends to that. You know, the whole point is that the Terminator that's been sent back to help them is telling them exactly what they need to do to make sure that Skynet never comes about. You know, Miles Dyson needs to die. The chip they've got needs to be destroyed. The Terminator needs to be destroyed, including himself. And they do all of that. Spoiler alert. But they do. To be fair, it came out in like nearly 30 years ago. So they do all that. It's all done. It's all ended. And Sarah Connor and John Connor get to ride off into the sunset, as it were. And their characters have really earned it by that point. And it's nice because they're estranged at the start of the movie because she's in a mental institution and he's hopping from foster home to foster home and getting himself into a lot of trouble. So it's nice that, it's a good payoff. It's a good emotional payoff. You get to see they finally achieve their objective. They've gone through this horrendous time in the first movie and then the second movie. And Robert Patrick, another reason why the movie is fantastic is because Robert Patrick plays one of the greatest villains I've ever seen without saying anything. He's got very few lines of dialogue in the movie. He doesn't need it. Doesn't need the dialogue. He's intimidating. He's got almost no expression on his face, and the way that he runs after them, it's I watched a thing on YouTube not so long ago. I forget whose channel it was, so I apologise. But this guy was going back to the locations where they shot Terminator 2 and with Robert Patrick asking him about the way they put the movie together. And he put a huge amount of thought into how he was going to do that character. He didn't just show up and think, okay, I'm going to be intimidating. He put a great deal of pressure on himself to make sure that the run was right, the way he carried himself was right, the look on his face was right. And for anyone that's seen that movie and really appreciates the effort he put in, it was absolutely worth it. But it's got an iconic soundtrack to it. I mean, the scene where Arnold's standing there with a Gatling gun shooting at helicopters is an incredible piece of action. But it tells a really good story as well. But it comes to an end. And as people that grew up, born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, fans of Stallone as well, and he's got this problem, probably more than a lot of people, where he doesn't want to say goodbye to his characters, and he's in his 70s, and it gets to a point where you're like, when you hear like, oh, there's going to be a new Terminator movie, but Arnold's involved, you're like, okay, well, yeah, that might be okay, but will it or won't it? I love Arnold, but he's getting really old now. How do you explain it? How do you keep explaining that the Terminator's gotten old, and they keep finding new and creative ways to do it? And the same with Rambo. Last Blood kind of implies that it's going to be the end, and then, spoiler alert, it's not. Why is there this huge reluctance to tie off people's stories? Because that's the thing about a great story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think that's why people really invest in trilogies as moviegoers, because it's a natural progression, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's worked really well for George Lucas for his entire career. It worked really well for The Matrix until you get to the end and you feel like there isn't actually an end. And I didn't feel too bothered about it, but I know a lot of people were really angry and had a lot of questions left over from that. But my point still stands. That's how you tell a story. It's a given construct for a really good reason. It works. So why is there this reluctance to end anything these days? Things seem to keep either being rebooted or retold, or you bring out a sequel, 30 odd years after the fact of the original, and you try, especially in the case of Terminator, to undo everything that you did years ago, because what you did years ago was end it. So now you have to undo the endings so that you can continue the story just for the sake of making a movie. I get your point's completely valid. You will make money off of it. It's guaranteed movie buys. But should they be made? from a creative point, rather than a businessman's point of view, from a storyteller's point of view and a fan's point of view, should these movies be made?
Yeah, from a fan's perspective, ultimately I think we're going to say no, unless of course they do it well and they actually advance the story. Ultimately, it's a difficult art, I imagine, especially these days, where you need to give closure to a story, but then allow an angle for a potential future project that makes sense, not one that's just kind of you backtrack and undo and create some continuity errors to allow a sequel to move forward. Without saying exactly what it is, probably my favourite one ever is the end of Halloween H2O, going into Halloween Resurrection. I won't say exactly what happened, of course, in case anyone hasn't seen it, but that, to me, is the perfect example of a film that has dead-on perfect closure, but then they really creatively find a way to bring in a sequel that doesn't absolutely ruin the end of the previous film. And I think that's a very difficult art to be able to write that these days, because of course studios want to option the right for a sequel if they haven't already planned for it, and so generally speaking that'll often take away from the ending. That from a fan's perspective, of course, again it comes back to money, of course, but from tying up a story, it's you have to have a point where you tie up the story, and ideally you not to use it for marketing, the big this is the final so and so, because oftentimes even if it's not the final one, there's a spin-off, there's a TV show that will follow on from it, or be a prequel, or so it's a bit difficult when they advertise and use for marketing that this is the last whatever, because very usually it's not.
Yeah, I think you hit on something there that's I would argue, if you want to tell more story about something, you need to shift medium. So if you've got a successful movie franchise, and then let's say for argument's sake 10 years down the line people are clamouring for more story, I think the best thing to do from a creative point of view and from an intrigue point of view, so that fans are interested and they've got something different to watch, is tell a different story. It can exist in the same universe as the movies did, but shift it to television, because instantly that changes the structure of the stories that you can tell, but also focus on different people. So like Sarah Connor Chronicles, for example, you're focusing on a main character but at a different point in her life that you didn't see before, and there's different interactions, and it does give you a little bit of license to play with things a little bit without damaging the movie continuity necessarily. That's probably not one of the most successful examples, but I think that's what you need to do, rather than just trying to make a movie. Because potentially, if if a TV show is less of an investment right off the bat, and if there's interest, you reinvest, you put a new season out, and it can, in theory, go as long as people are interested in watching it. So if it is interesting, fans will let you know, and then you'll end up making more money than you would have done with a movie, with less of an initial investment. So things like that are not always a terrible way to go. There's one thing I want to touch on, and I'm going to stick with Terminator for a moment, because it's a really good example of the point I'm trying to make, and then I'm going to move on to something else. I mentioned earlier about critically acclaimed movies and differences in genre between those two decades, but the way it does seem to be that a lot of movies recently are they make decisions, or they make entire movies for the purposes of trying to make certain people happy, the vocal minorities perhaps, and Terminator, so the most recent movie, is a good example. So if you haven't seen it, skip ahead a minute or so, but there's in that the movie, right at the beginning of the movie, you end up taking out the character who was the main driving point of the first two movies. Terminator 2 is one of the few cases in cinematic history where the sequel was more successful and arguably better than the original, because it's a great movie in of itself, self-contained. It's a really good film, but it doesn't mess up anything from the first film. All it does is build upon it, and it ties it up nicely. Then you take the whole premise of that with the most recent Terminator film and undo it, and then you shoehorn in a female character in the place of the male character that you've removed. Now, the big problem I've got with this is nothing to do with there being a female character. The big problem I've got with it was that Terminator, from its inception, had a strong female character already. So you've overlooked the fact that Sarah Connor is the hero of these movies. She's got no superpowers or anything. In the first movie, she's got no skills even. She's desperately trying to survive. She gets help, but she's the person that builds herself into this soldier with no help from anybody else, and then gets back with her son and protects him and keeps him safe. Then years later, we start a new movie where all of that is undone in a moment, and all of her hard work goes out the window. You completely tread on the existing heroine of the movies and get rid of the who is going to be the male hero of the movies. But let's not forget, John Connor is not the hero in these movies. The whole premise is that he is going to be in the future. You're not supposed to ever actually see it. It's the idea that she is the hero who keeps him safe. A woman is protecting a man. That's kind of the whole point of all of it. And then it's all undone for the sake of saying that the hero of the Resistance is now going to be a woman. It didn't need to happen. I don't understand why where this concept has come from, that you can't write strong female characters or strong characters of colour. You have to remove an existing popular character and replace them with somebody who is of a different gender or a different colour or a different belief or anything like that. You can write strong characters and you can make them whatever you want to make them, and the proof is out there in the world, in world cinema. These characters already exist, and they have existed for a long time, and they're largely being overlooked. In 1939, when Gone with the Wind came out, which was banned not so long ago because it's racially insensitive, one of the people that won an Oscar for that movie was a black lady. I'm ashamed that I can't remember her name because it is my favourite movie of all time, but she won an Oscar for her incredible performance, and it is brilliant. She's fantastic in it, and it was recognised in 1939, before World War II broke out. So let's not lose our minds over it. Let's try and get some perspective. You don't need to remove James Bond or Jason Bourne and then make them Jane Bourne and Jane Bond. You can write strong female characters. They already exist in cinema. They exist in books. You could write brand new ones. People do write them. I think it diminishes the whole argument of trying to raise up certain people by saying that you need to mould them into the form of a male character. Doesn't that kind of undo the argument? What do you think? Is that not counterproductive to try and do that?
I think Matt Damon said it not that long ago, and completely agree with him. Which is basically, with any role, you focus on who is best suited to that role.
Absolutely.
Not the reverse, which is, of course, like you've already identified a belief system, a colour, a gender, etc., and now the character will be, kind of a round peg in a square hole, fit into the story, ultimately. But, of course, equally, you can write the character to be the particular one, as long as that makes sense, of course, ultimately. So it's just not, as you mentioned, with kind of, James Bond, etc., trying not to take away the established characters of the past that we know and love, who've created a lot of great inspiration for future characters in films, and say that's not representative of our time, so therefore we're going to find a way to either kill them or discredit them in favour of a new character who is more representative of our time. Whereas I think we've discussed this before, simply just create a new character. Don't undo the previous characters as a way of saying they're not as good as our new character, but it makes a big statement if our new character is shown to be better than the old character. Then of course it undoes everything. But understandably they do it to make a strong statement. but of course it causes issues.
James Bond's a good example because he's not meant to be a lovable character. He's charming, which is why he manages to get with so many women, but he is a roguish character. He is a misogynist. He is not particularly kind about or to women, nor has he ever been, probably because he was written in a time when the sensibilities between single career-driven men and young single women were very different. The world was a different place politically and socially, and it was acceptable to write things like that now. And I get that the world's moved on, things change, and people want that reflected. But I'm a great believer that you shouldn't retcon history, because there's that old saying: those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I think that's completely true. I think you should leave things like that in place as a constant reminder that, well, if we want to write a new character who is akin to a James Bond or Jason Bourne, which is what I was kind of hoping for from the Black Widow movie that came out recently. I think maybe what a lot of fans were hoping for, and unfortunately not what it turned out to be. I thought that character had all the earmarks of being a complete female equal, or even potentially a superior to a Jason Bourne type character, had they gone down the route of not trying to make a Marvel movie but just making a good spy thriller or something like that. It probably would have made her character shine a lot more, and I think been a better movie. That's just my opinion on it, but if you haven't seen the movie, it's definitely still worth a watch. But I was left thinking that there was some missed opportunities there. But I'm gonna move on from all that. But the point was that with people talking about making movies just for the sake of ticking boxes, I don't think that should be a primary concern. And the same as Matt Damon, and I know he caught a lot of flack for saying that. I think he's completely true. You should make a movie or anything in terms of performance arts or anything creative. Your only objectives should be, how do I express what I'm trying to convey? You shouldn't be self-censoring all the way along. Great art throughout history has been censored by plenty of other people, and if it stands out and people speak up about it, it starts a conversation, which is a good thing, And if we're talking about something and people feel very strongly and passionately about something, often that sparks something that needs to be discussed. But self-censoring doesn't get us anywhere. All it does is make people repress things that do need talking about, and draws the emphasis to something completely different, which needn't be the case. Anyhow, back to the subject. We're going to talk about genres, mainly because as I was talking to Byron about this before we started recording, I feel like, and I'd love to stand corrected if I'm wrong, but I feel like the genre of suspense thriller doesn't really exist in popular cinema today, and I stress the word popular cinema. So there's a couple of movies, or off the top of my head, the Pelican Brief, probably Frequency. That's got thriller aspects to it. Fugitive, Sleeping with the Enemy. There was The Net with Sandra Bullock. There's a number of films like that from the early to mid 90s that were based on books largely, that were real proper suspense thrillers, in as much as they later down the line, I feel like that genre split and went more into either being a horror movie or an action movie, because a suspense thriller has elements of both of those, except it's not fantastical, in the way that a horror movie would be. It's not, there's not some big supernatural monster, there's no magic or anything involved, there's no ghosts or anything like that. What's happening to you is very, very grounded in reality, and that's why it's more frightening. But it's a kind of movie where you are quite literally supposed to be on the edge of your seat for the entire thing. You're supposed to be gripped by this movie, and things like The Fugitive and US Marshals that followed it up. You get that sense it's a chase movie. Somebody's chasing you down. You're being hunted. You're trying to hide. You're not sure what to do. You're constantly thinking on the fly. I don't feel like movies exist with that sort of purity that it can be specified in one particular genre anymore. I think there's movies that have got elements of those, but as a strict genre of suspense thriller, I don't think they exist in the world, in popular cinema anymore, and I think it's a shame because they were really great films, and they they tell a great story, but also they keep you gripped, they keep you really locked in, and they take you along for the ride. So, do you agree with me? Do you think can you think of anything off the top of your head? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't feel like any of those kind of films are really present today. It's a difficult one because, of course, maybe they're not suited to the more modern audience for whatever reason, through research that they've done potentially, and because we have crossed over both decades and we know the differences, then of course maybe we miss ones, and we do kind of wonder how maybe a modern spin on some of these kind of scripts would work out. But yeah, I can't think of any modern ones that kind of cover that kind of genre. It feels like kind of possibly a dying/dead genre.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of things, like we touched on already. There's a lot of things that are being remade or rebooted. It, for example, I loved the original miniseries when I was a kid. Again, based on a story. It's a lot of great movies are based on books first, because you've got depth, you've got real richness to the characters and the story. Because when you're writing a novel, you have to paint a picture with words. You've got no visual medium to work with. You've got no soundtrack to work with. You have to say it all using adjectives, and you have to be really descriptive and really vivid, and that gives you a great amount to work. Like The Shining, for example. If you pitch that, if your elevator pitch is it's about a writer who takes his family to this hotel during the off season to look after it so that he can sit and write a book, I think the studio is going to say no. If you read The Shining or you watch the movie, you're gripped by it. Not to say that this is a suspense thriller. It's absolutely not. It's obviously more of a horror film, but they do, as I said, they do share elements. But my point is, you've got a rich resource to draw from if you're making movies that were based on books. And John Grisham and Stephen King and put a lot of great movies into the world off the back of their books in the 90s, like The Firm, for example. That's another one. There was, going through the lists, what made me think about this is that there are a lot of movies, particularly in the 90s, that are great films, like Fight Club, for example, listed really, really high on the greatest movies of all time by IMDb, but not one of the highest grossing movies of the decade. Neither was The Matrix, neither was Ghost, but there's a lot of these movies which didn't break that bracket that people would watch today. I know several of these films. My wife isn't a movie buff by any means, so I get a blank slate whenever I re-watch these movies and get a more up-to-date interpretation of whether or not they enjoyed it. Obviously it's just one person's opinion, but it is somebody watching it in the modern day who's never seen them and doesn't know anything about them. And I think a lot of these movies would still be well received today, and they were successful. I'm not saying any of these films that I've mentioned didn't do well at the box office. They did. They just didn't break the top 10. But they were great stories. They're cult classics and things like Jerry Maguire, for example, 1996. My favourite director of all time puts out Jerry Maguire, and I think it's an amazing story. And again, if you gave an elevator pitch of that movie, somebody would probably not want to buy it from you. But that's not what it's about. It's about the interactions between people. It's about the way people think, those moments that people share that you probably think about but don't talk about. There's a lot going on in that movie. There's some incredible performances. I think I'm right in saying Cuba Gooding Jr. won an Oscar for that, for Best Supporting Actor. It's got a great soundtrack to it. There's a lot of cult classics that happen in the 90s. There's a lot of critically acclaimed movies that happen in the 90s, and there was a lot of diversity in terms of the type and the genre that was being put out in the 90s, as well as the music. I think creative mediums, for my money, across the board, art, music, books, movies, hell, even in sport, I think there was more going on in the 90s. There was more content and there was better quality of content. I feel like probably because, and this is just my 2 cents on it, but probably because the handcuffs were off. You know, people didn't have so many restrictions in terms of what they could say and do, and they were focused more on creating trying to say what they wanted to say with their piece of art, whatever that medium may be that they were putting their art into. Their creative outlet was unrestricted, it was unhindered and uncensored, and that's not really the case these days. I feel like maybe as a result of that, a lot of studios, especially where we've gone through a couple of big recessions since then, are probably more reluctant to spend a big amount of money on something they don't know is going to be a hit, so they're resorting to older material. But I don't think it's necessarily the best way to go. It's obviously you're reintroducing older properties to a new audience, and that's why there's built-in ticket buyers, and it's going to make money with, like It, for example. You know, as long as you put together a solid movie, it doesn't have to detract too much from the original, and it can still be successful. I would argue that if they gambled a little bit more on more independent scripts, I think Taika Waititi is a good example for somebody that's a very creative, indulgently creative person, ended up sort of stumbling into this position where he's working for a huge studio, and as far as I'm concerned, nothing but good things have come from it. I feel like I've wandered off the point considerably. I started somewhere and I lost my train of where that was going to end. But anyway, I feel there's some good stories that are out these days. There's some great movies that are being made. I think it'd just be nice to see a little bit more of the creative freedoms that we were afforded in the 90s. I don't think it's designed in any way to hurt anybody. It's escapism. It's a creative outlet. I think it's only for the betterment of everyone as a society, personally. But there we go. That's a breakdown of basically what were commercially very successful movies in the 90s versus today. There's a lot of parallels to be drawn. The main difference being that a number of those movies were original in the 90s, and perhaps today that's not the case. And look at some of the more critically acclaimed movies in the 90s compared to today. And it's difficult to tell because we haven't really got much in terms of hindsight, looking at it from just after the fact. But were there any movies for your money in the last 10 years that you think are going to stand the test of time, and we're going to be talking about in 10, 20, 30 years' time and saying, oh, it was iconic, like a Forrest Gump or a Jurassic Park, for example? So let us know what you think. Drop something in the comments, and if you don't agree with us, great, say so. It's always good. These things are a great conversation starter. It's a good thing to talk about. So that's our 2 cents on the difference between movies in the 90s, movies in the last decade, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you've made it this far, then score 1 for the Republic. Whether you've agreed with us or not, feel free to evacuate your emotional baggage in the comments section. Hammer that like button as if you were Thor doing a home renovation, and if you subscribe, there is a slight possibility that your life will instantly go all the way up to 11. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.